Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I am senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. I am joined by managing editor Dave Noyce, who oversees the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access transcripts to our podcast and our complete newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at Mormon.land. Now for today's show. To Christians everywhere, the story of refugees is part of Scripture. It is sacred. Adam and Eve, Moses and the Israelites, the Book of Mormon's Lehi and his family, even Mary, Joseph, and the child Jesus. The history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also includes an epic journey of migrants fleeing persecution to find a promised land. Latter-day Saints then have a natural affinity for immigrants. On top of that, modern Mormonism attracts converts seeking a better life. Uprooted from their homes, many immigrants find a safe haven in the religious and congregational life of Latter-day Saints. What should the Church and its members think and do about current U.S. efforts to round up and deport immigrants who lack current legal status, and even in many cases, those who are here legally? Charles Kuck, a Latter-day Saint immigration attorney in Atlanta, who has served as a bishop of a Spanish-language congregation, joins us virtually to discuss the church and immigration. Charles, welcome.
Thanks for having me today, Peggy.
Okay, so let's do some background. How did you get involved in immigration law?
You know, that's an interesting story, and it kind of goes back to my mission in Peru. When I was called from Peru, I actually grew up in New York. I'm not a Latter-day Saint. I'm a convert to the church. I don't have a big, long history of pioneer heritage, and the Lord decided to send me to Peru. And I came back and married a sister missionary for my mission. She grew up, she does have pioneer heritage. And I went to law school. And immigration, to me, this was during Ronald Reagan's presidency. Ronald Reagan, if you recall, campaigned heavily on amnesty. In that he wanted to create an amnesty. And there's a great famous debate between him and George W. Bush during the campaign about who had a better amnesty plan. So when I went to law school, that basically it solved itself. In 1984, 1986, amnesty passed. I was my first year of law school, and I didn't think about immigration law. I didn't take immigration law. LA law was on television. I thought I was going to just become Arnie Becker and litigate. And I took the bar exam in Arizona. I'm an Arizona State grad from law school. And I was sitting in a library waiting for my bar exam results in August of 1989. And a friend of mine at the firm came in and said, "Hey, you speak Spanish?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "You want to take an immigration case in immigration court?" And I said, "I didn't even take immigration law school." He said, "Not a problem." And I said, "I'm not a lawyer yet." He says, "Not a problem. You don't have to be in immigration court." So that month I took a pro bono asylum case for a Guatemalan farmer, and I had the trial in that case 45 days later and won asylum for that person. And I fell in love with immigration. And I grew up in a home of immigrants. My grandparents are immigrants from Germany. They came between the two world wars. And to me, the immigrant experience was just a very natural kind of experience. And over the period of the next couple of years, I took a series of pro bono cases because I actually had a job at a law firm not doing immigration law. And I just fell in love. And 2 years into it, I decided to make immigration my career. And for me, it's been a remarkable journey where I've gotten to meet amazing people that have made remarkable contributions to America, that have made us a much greater country than we could have been. And I did it at a time when basically, by coincidence, we ended up bringing a lot of immigrants to America because of who we were. I always harken back. In fact, I posted yesterday Ronald Reagan's farewell speech from his last day in the White House. And he spoke about America as immigration and what a great thing immigrants are to America. And that's always been my bellwether for me. And, we sit here today with a very different Republican Party, very different scenario. And I wonder if we can get through this and reclaim the vision that Reagan at least had for America as a shining city on a hill.
Wow. Charles, is just thinking as you're talking about that, that's when we had sweeping immigration reforms and all this happening. How far we've come in just these 40 plus years. Let's jump to this current political climate. What advice generally do you give immigrants who lack current legal status, especially those who are Latter-day Saints?
Well, the one thing a lawyer cannot do is tell somebody to do something that's illegal. Right? Lawyers can't tell you we can't tell you to stay here illegally. What we can tell you is what your rights are in the United States. As Antonin Scalia famously pointed out, everybody has the same rights regardless of their immigration status in the United States. So your biggest right is your right to remain silent. You have no obligation to answer questions from anybody about anything. So keep your mouth shut. That's item one. Two, you should talk to legal counsel to see if there's some way out of your situation. Unfortunately, for many people, there's really no way out of it. And the third is if you are for no reason detained, immediately ask for a lawyer and keep your mouth shut at that point, and see if there are options, because our immigration laws are weird. They're strange. They're complicated. And for many people who are detained, there is a bond eligibility. If you've been here long enough, you can fight to stay. So it's for Latter-day Saints today, I tell them this exact same things, but I also tell them to fast and pray for change, because at the end of the day, it's only Congress that can fix the situation we have, because it's Congress that put us into this situation in the first place.
Our reporting has shown that a number of immigrants, wary of ICE and raids, are staying away from places, even church. Have you seen this happening in where you live?
Yeah, we've 100% see this. I go to church in Tennessee, where we have our permanent home, and we've absolutely seen a drop off in attendance starting in November. We're beginning to see people come back, because there are certain parts of the country that don't have the level of enforcement that you're seeing in the press. The Californias, the New Yorks. You're typically not seeing that in, quote, red states, because ICE is sending the red state agents to California to do those kind of efforts. And so, especially in the rural areas where I live, we don't see that level of enforcement. So we're seeing people come back. But here in Atlanta, where I served and where I currently work, we're definitely still seeing some enforcement actions and people still staying away from church. And it's not just our church; they're staying away from a lot of church experiencing this exact same problem.
So recently, the church reiterated its position that bishops should not go beyond the temple, recommend questions, and definitely should not ask immigrants their status, because that's not one of the questions. But what advice do you have you've been a bishop, local leaders at congregations on dealing with this?
Well, it's really interesting. As a leader, you get to know people intimately, and you know their status. I mean, I'm a little more savvy than most bishops might be on this issue, but you know their status. And the reality is the Lord doesn't care. He doesn't care. I know a lot of members harken back, well, you must honor and obey all the laws. Yeah, we ignored that during polygamy too. All right. So there are laws that are just, there are laws that are unjust, and we do our best with what we have. The Lord's more concerned about, in my opinion, individuals' own salvation, and not necessarily what their immigration status is in the United States. At the same time, I let people know, there's options for people, and sometimes options are good for people to return back to their birth country. But for many of the people, at least in my congregation, they had been in the United States since they were children. I mean, like babies. There is no other country they might know to go back to. So for them, I simply tell them to have good friends that vote and get the right people to change the laws the right way.
So you've told me before that people being arrested by ICE should know their rights and demand to see identification or a warrant. But that doesn't seem to be feasible in the current climate.
Well, there are conditions under which you want to do that. For example, if somebody's knocking on your door, obviously don't open the door. Every American knows that. You don't open the door. You say, where's your warrant? If you don't have a warrant, you're not coming in. We are seeing reports of ICE breaking into cars, which I think is wildly illegal. A car is your house if you're inside of it. They can't break into that without a warrant. So sometimes that kind of advice doesn't work. At the same time, it does work for people who are in a physical home, in a place that ICE does respect the laws. What's been really interesting is to see how many American citizens now, when they see ICE doing these confrontations, are recording these incidences and confronting the ICE agents fearlessly. What are you doing? What you're doing is illegal. How can you justify this? How can you do this? And I think that's backed off a number of times. We've seen videos of ICE agents just leaving when confronted by U.S. citizen neighbors with the video camera.
So should members? I was wondering, do you think members should accompany their fellow Latter-day Saints to immigration court, or should they be recording these things, or are those some ways they could help?
Well, immigration, just to think first part of the question, immigration court. Immigration court is a really weird place where the Constitution only applies halfway. These are hearings that are open to the public. Anybody could go to them. And it certainly doesn't hurt you to accompany somebody to court. But at the same time, you have to understand that the administration can go after you for transporting somebody, literally giving a ride to somebody. They can come after you. So if you're going to go to court, I would suggest you let Uber handle that problem and you meet them in court and certainly sit with them. I've seen immigration judges grant bonds to people because there were friends waiting in the courtroom to testify what a good person they were. So, yeah, I mean, the ability to influence the court is important because the courts remain, at least for the most part, fair. ICE, on the other hand, is just going to do what they have to do. The agents see themselves with the job. Their job now has a quota, although now federal judges are asking about these quotas that have been put on them. But it's clear there is quotas, and they've been told they will be fired unless they meet their quota. So I don't think they want to be fired. So they do their job. Some of them enjoy the job more than others.
So we haven't heard, frankly, any reports of this, but it has been suggested. What if ICE shows up at, say, a sacrament service and wanted to detain somebody or remove somebody? And some have argued that would violate religious freedom protections. How do you view that?
Oh, it absolutely does. In fact, we were retained by a group of churches here in Atlanta to litigate this exact issue. You may be aware this issue was litigated or began to be litigated in the Northeast. And the case was set aside by the judge because he said, has this happened yet? Has it happened? And the answer is no. That's happened. There was a report of an ICE agent going onto the property of a church here in Atlanta, but not entering the sanctuary. And the priest, it was a Catholic church, priest asked them to leave and they left. Because ICE had canceled the memo, the new ICE administration canceled the memo disallowing that type of activity. But we haven't seen them do it. And frankly, I don't think they're going to do it. I don't see them walking into an LDS sacrament meeting to arrest, Brother Gomez because he's got an outstanding removal order. It's just far easier for them to wait outside. I think what people don't really understand is ICE agents are human beings too. They don't want to put themselves in danger. They don't want to make things more difficult for themselves or necessarily for others. So they're going to do what's safest for them. And the safest is just wait outside. You know who somebody is. You know what where his car is. You just wait by his car for him to come out. So I don't see that happening. So I think for any congregation, whether it be Latter-day Saints or Presbyterian or Catholic, I think there's still a level of protection that goes with that sanctuary, despite the fact that the memo has been disabused. And we did not proceed with our lawsuit because of that, but we actually have it written. First time it happens, we will file and put an end to that.
So, Charles, I was thinking while you were talking about how you fell in love with immigration law, you sort of stumbled into it and fell in love with it. I was curious, how do you see your faith informing that work?
I love that question because I think my faith is really repeats the American story. And the Book of Mormon itself talks very explicitly about immigration. There are three major migrations in the Book of Mormon from the Old World. So it's an entire book about immigration. But just looking at Lehi's blessing of his children in 2 Nephi 1, verses 5 and 6, where the Lord essentially says, nobody comes here to this land. Now, the land, you can argue what the land is. I think arguably it's the United States without being sent by the Lord. I believe that. I 100% believe that. I believe it. I believe when it was written. I believe when I read it the first time in 1980 and 1979, and I believe it today. So it really informs my work. Plus, I look at my wife's ancestors who were British, right? They were British converts to the church who immigrated, who literally walked across the plains. So for me, our faith is an immigration story. And that is true in 2025, just as it was true in 1830. I mean, we see who joins the church today. We see the effect that the United States has had on the church. I mean, arguably, it's the only country in the world the church could have been established in to carry out its mission that we see today. And so for me, being a Latter-day Saint, I think our story is one of immigration.
So given that, do you think the church should speak out more strongly about some of these tactics against immigrants, or this, push?
As someone who is not I don't have to sit in the quorum of the 12 in Salt Lake and make decisions like this, but it's a worldwide church. It's not an American church anymore. It's a worldwide church. So they have to make decisions based upon worldwide activity. And I think the church has historically been, pretty measured when it comes to real political issues. And I think they're cognizant in Washington, D.C., that there's a variety of opinions among church members about the immigration issue that range from the far right to the far left. And at the same time, I think what they've said is about as strong as they can get in the current political climate. Given the fact the church has other interests that also move the church forward and protect its members. So I think the church's stance is as strong as we're going to get in 2025. But at the same time, I think the underlying message is clear that immigration is really important to us. And I think if individual apostles could speak out on this issue, I think you'd hear much stronger opinions.
Huh. So I want to, we touched on this already a little bit, Charles, and you brought it up. We know most Latter-day Saints voted for Donald Trump and apparently support this crackdown because this was the centerpiece of his campaign. And many of them, as you noted, cite the 12th Article of Faith's teaching of obeying, honoring, sustaining the law. Expound again about what's your response to that argument supporting this.
Well, I will tell you, I think a lot of people didn't understand the level to which Trump was, and I don't even think Trump understood the level that he was talking, because Donald Trump doesn't run the immigration apparatus. That's run by Stephen Miller, a deputy chief of staff who is an immigration expert, not a lawyer, but an immigration expert who's dedicated to white nationalism. That's really quite clear. I don't think people really understood that, which is why you see now people saying, whoa, Nelly, I didn't think you'd arrest Brother Gomez. He's a good man. He helps me out at my house, or he takes care of my mom, or he passes a sacrament. That's not the guy I thought you'd go after the criminals, without realizing that to these people, everybody's a criminal. And so it's the definition of the definition of criminal is everybody who's either overstayed a visa, which by the way is not a crime, or who is coming illegally, which, by the way, is a misdemeanor. So for me to look at this in this context of the 12th Article of Faith, I have to say, which laws? Every law? Well, then why in 1868 didn't we get rid of polygamy? Because it became federal law to be polygamous. I think Latter-day Saints can pick and choose sometimes the laws they obey or they agree with. And there's nothing wrong as a Latter-day Saint with trying to change the law. And sometimes that change is a civil disobedience. Many times it's an argument in public about why the law is wrong. And at the same time, I think we have to be cognizant that these laws that they're enforcing in 2025 were last written in 1996. In a very different world in which we live, both economically, socially, and politically. And I think if we were writing the laws today, as Congress should be doing, we wouldn't be facing the horror of family separation that you're seeing today. And I think that, to me, is the church's biggest issue, is the separation of families.
So let's just say this administration succeeds and deports many millions of people. How do you think it would affect the church, members in the pew, to missionary work, proselytizing?
Well, that's a great question, because, being actively involved in the church and seeing how our missionaries are teaching, who they're working, looking at the members that are joining today, many of them are immigrants, and not just Latinos. There's immigrants from all over. I've had conversations in the last week with Iranian converts to the church and African converts to the church, as well as Latin converts to the church here in Georgia. So I think it grossly affects our ability and dramatically affects our ability to expand the church inside the United States. I will tell you this, they will not be successful in deporting millions of people. And the reason for that is actually the laws. We have this really funky thing called the Constitution. Where we have this other thing called due process. So it has to be a process by which somebody goes to. And that's why you see the administration trying to force people to leave on their own, the self-deportation concept that Mitt Romney, by the way, initially came up with in 2012 and famously in debate. People aren't leaving. I mean, there are some that are leaving, but most aren't going to leave. And anybody who's picked up by the administration who has not already gone through an immigration court hearing has to go through an immigration court hearing. And rather than expand the immigration courts, the Trump administration has actually fired almost 100 immigration judges. And we're now down to only 600 judges in the country with over 4 million pending cases. And that was before Trump came in. There was 4 million pending cases. So the reality is, and Trump's even commented on this a couple of times, that this whole due process thing, so they shouldn't get hearings. Now, that should trouble a lot of Latter-day Saints, that, of course, everybody gets a hearing. And here's why. We have laws that say if you are afraid to go back to your home country and you're here, you get to apply for asylum. Well, that asylum is adjudicated by an immigration judge. Asylum hearings take anywhere from 2 to 10 hours. If you've been here longer than 10 years and you have children born here, you have a right to apply for what's called cancellation of removal. You can be given a green card by a judge because of the hardship suffered by your children. All of those require a hearing. And that's who Trump is picking up today, people who get these hearings who are stuck. Now, and I'll take a break here in a second and breathe, but what they're trying to do is detain people long enough that they give up these rights. That's what you're seeing today.
So sort of waiting them out, I guess you could say in some respects, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the Utah Compact, which was obviously from Utah and sort of some states trying to replicate it or efforts to. It emphasizes humane treatment of immigrants, keeping families together, focusing deportation on serious criminals. You know, not the Brother Gomez example you talked about. The church did not sign the compact, but it did endorse it twice. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that? Can that be applied here if that was more readily applied? Which also calls for immigration reform, of course, too, on a larger scale.
The compact was brilliant, actually. First of its kind in the United States. One of the key factors that parts of that was to allow states to create their own visas to bring people in. Keep in mind, this was in 2010 when Utah was desperately short of labor. Mm-hmm. Build houses, to build the economy moving forward, but they needed Congress. Only Congress can create those visas. I think Congress could have created the ability of states to do it, but they basically didn't have, which is Congress normally does on immigration. But it was a brilliant move by Utah that was emulated here in Georgia. And Georgia began the same type of process, the same type of legislation here. It never ultimately came to fruition because of other political issues here in Georgia. But it was set a great example because basically what it talked about was what Congress has to do. You need to deal with those that are undocumented. Yes, there's a lot of undocumented people here in sheer numbers, but not percentage-wise. It's like less than 2% of the population. It's a relatively small number of the overall greater number. But what was really good about the compromise is that it was forward-looking. What are we going to do in the future? Something Congress is terrible at doing. And I will go back to Reagan when they created the amnesty. The reason for the amnesty is there was about 3 million undocumented men, almost all men, mostly from Mexico in the United States in the 70s and then into the early 80s. And it was, remember, the economy was beginning to grow, was beginning to develop. The jobs were being created. And there was, again, even back then, jobs Americans weren't going to do, which include picking vegetables in the Utah desert that are growing out there. And what they did, their solution was, we're going to give you a green card. And in return, we're going to make every employer in America an immigration agent by having you fill out an I-9. So everybody that works from now on, and that will solve the problem. Well, it didn't solve the problem. In fact, it caused more problems, because what ended up happening is those men got green cards. Well, most of those men were just traveling back and forth across the border in the wintertime. Now they brought their families illegally because the border was still wide open. And now you doubled, literally in 6 years, you doubled the number of undocumented immigrants. Literally went to 6 million by 1996, which is when Congress passed the law that we have today, which is the Illegal Immigration Responsibility Act, kind of a weird name for a law, that has all these punishments on it, that give all these powers to the federal government, which up until this year have never really been used. So the compact, in the middle of this fervor in 2010, 2011, says, let's take a step back. Let's be forward-looking. Let's look at what we're going to need in 10, 20, 30 years, rather than fixing problems from the past. Congress isn't listening. Including our own senators and congressmen in Utah are not listening.
And of course, they are LDS.
Oh, of course, yes.
So recently, actually, last week, a stake president in Los Angeles called for a statewide fast for immigrants, knowing what to do to help immigrants, feeling compassion and connection to them. Also, a whole list of actions the state could and has been taking to help immigrants. What do you think the church writ large in America could do on this?
Well,
what are the kinds of things you would like to see the church do besides make pronouncements?
Yeah, I would love to see a church-wide fast for not just for immigrants, but for our Congress to fix this issue. Wouldn't it be great if this wasn't an issue? If this was not a political issue anymore because Congress fixed it, wouldn't that be awesome? So you have to ask yourself, why don't they fix it? So, a church-wide call for a fast for members of Congress to fix the immigration issue would be fantastic. The church is not into civil disobedience. It's not our brand of Christianity as far as being out there and forcing change. We tend to work behind the scenes, and the church is very powerful behind the scenes in working on some issues that are important. I think what I'd like to see is more talk about how we treat our fellow man. Elder Utark gave a great talk in conference about this several years ago, about his own immigration story, twice a refugee. I would love to see more talks about that. We have two apostles who are immigrants, right? They're immigrants to America. This is not their native country. They bring a very interesting perspective to who we are and who we can be. And I think we see that in their specific talks about how we treat people. I'd like to see more of that. And I think we are seeing some of that. In fact, we have Elder Dubé coming to speak to our stake this weekend. Just on not a conference, just a meeting to meet with people. And he talks about this issue frequently as well.
He's from Africa for our listeners.
Yeah. That's right. So that's the church as an institution, kind of, and higher up. What can individual rank and file members do?
Oh, members can do lots of interesting things, because members can go out and protest. Members can go out and video record ICE activities and put them on the internet. They can go out and speak on social media about why this is important. They can serve those members who are being affected negatively by this process. I mean, early on in January, I got a phone call the day after the inauguration from a bishop here in my old stake here in Atlanta, and said, "Could you come speak to our members this Sunday? Can you come in and talk to them?" Cleared it with the stake and got it all done. And we had 150 people at that meeting to talk about how to prepare for what's going on. You don't need an immigration lawyer to do that. You can go down and sit next to your brother that was born in a different country, who and you generally know, who has an unsettled immigration status. Put your arm around them, tell them you love them. Give them that emotional and physical support that they need to carry on. Some people are going to choose to go back to their home country, especially those that came recently under the Biden administration. Some of those folks are going to go back to their home country. And if they join the church here, you want them to bring with them what they've learned here to reinforce the church back in their home country. There was an interesting experience after I left Peru in 1983. A couple years later, the church stopped sending Americans down there because they were having a kind of an internal civil war with some guerrillas. And there was about six or 7 years in which no Latter-day Saint leadership were white. There was no gringos in Peru. What happened there then was that the local leadership became exceptionally strong. And today it leads Latin America. It's where one of the church's area offices. It leads Latin America in growth. It leads Latin America in temples. I'm talking about not Brazil, but the rest of Latin America. And it was because they had to do it themselves. And I see anybody who decides to go back home or has to go back home or is brought back home by ICE, you want them to bring the church with them to make that church stronger where they are. And maybe that's why the Lord brought them here in the first place. Maybe that's part of the covenant of Lehi's blessing, that people are brought here for a reason. Sometimes that reason is to take the church home. Sometimes it's the reason to make the church strong here and create that salvation in their own lives. So I see it either way. I think it can be a blessing, but for members, we need to love. That's our job. Love and serve. That's what we're required to do. We're absolutely not here to judge. Ever.
Charles Kuck, this has been fascinating. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. I always love talking. Gracious, Peggy.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Nicole Weaver. We remind our listeners they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.